the research themselves. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Communicating this kind of stuff is hard. But okay, beginning in 3, 2, 1. Ayo, what's up, guys? We got my favorite TikTok communist on, my favorite Florida man, Marxist Miguel. You want to introduce yourself?
what's going on?
How did you become sort of like a leftist and like a content creator? Could you like speak to that?
Honestly, so the way it started was I was working in a call center with a guy who was a teacher. He was a
Right.
college professor, and he quit his job because of all the Ron DeSantis stuff and everything like that. He hated all the stuff they were doing in the schools. So
Okay.
he got in a big fight school board and just left. And so he joined us up over there, and me and him just got to talking. And at the time, I was already exploring leftist thought and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It kind of all started with the Bernie Sanders movement, and just talking to people and trying to defend points that you think are valuable just kind of drive you to figure things out a little bit better. So, long story short, I end up running into this guy, and we just keep going back and forth about things, and he's fantastic with history and all that.
Yeah.
Drove me to ask more questions, and then eventually he's just like, why don't you just jump on social media and start talking about this stuff? Like, this is great information.
Right.
And I was like, honestly, like, I don't think anybody would really care to listen to it. You know what I mean? I feel like Americans in general just don't really care about other stuff that's outside of the U.S., and at the time I was focusing on a lot of like geopolitical stuff and other countries' issues.
Right.
So just kind of try to circle that back around to U.S. issues and stuff like that. And eventually I was just like, you know what? Maybe I should do a couple of videos, see what happens. And so that's kind of how it started. I did a couple, got pretty positive feedback, and I was just like, you know what? Maybe I should just keep doing it. There's
Yeah.
obviously other people out there that feel the same way and they understand it. And if I can try to explain things in a way that makes it easy enough for people to understand, it could be pretty valuable, And so that's kind of how it went.
Yeah. I really like your channel. It's sort of like a socialism 101. Really just breaks down like these hard concepts to make it simplified. You're also we were talking about this off camera. You're also Cuban. Did that affect how you viewed socialism at all, or like your family story?
It did. It did, and not until later on,
Mm-hmm.
because I never dove into the history of Cuba too much until I just started talking with family members, and they started filling me in on little things. I mean, for the most part, I live here in Florida, so the stigma around Cuba has always been pretty negative
Right.
for the most part, and so I never really cared to look too much into it until I started talking with family members, and they would tell me things like, well, this is screwed up that America does this because in Cuba they do this. And, I'll just hear little things here and there. And I'm like, wow, that really doesn't sound that bad. So why is it, why is the hardship, the struggle so bad over there? They bring up things like sanctions, and that just got me into trying to figure out what all this stuff meant, and I'm just sitting there like, there's more to the picture than, they can't buy a car because, they're lazy or whatever the story may
Right.
be.
Right.
There's actually something going on that's preventing them from progressing materially in an efficient way, and so once I started figuring a lot of those things out, it just opened up a can of worms, and I was off to just try to figure it all out.
Yeah, of course. I think like one of the things that radicalized me so early on was just learning about Latin American history. And when you learn about Latin American history, you very quickly just realize like the communists were kind of the good guys in a lot of ways. Like in a lot of these places, they were preventing like large American corporations from taking their assets, things like that. America overthrew like every single democratically elected regime. And so you just sort of quickly understand why they needed communist guerrillas, a little bit of state authority, things like that, especially like America's history within the region. Speaking of that, why do you think the CIA has, sort of fallen off in terms of like getting coups within Latin America, like Bolivia, Venezuela, even SOS Cuba, the CIA's sort of been trying, but it hasn't really been succeeding that well. What do you think's been that decline?
Honestly, from what I think, and it could be wrong, I just don't think they have such a strong stranglehold on these developing countries as they once did before.
Right.
Obviously, there's a lot of corruption and stuff like that, but I think I mean, the technology's gotten better, but these countries are also developing slowly, and I think they're not as easy to manage and control anymore. There's more information. It's easier to figure things out. It's not as easy to hide things anymore.
Yeah.
They're more careful about the way they do things. And I think that's playing a factor. I also think there's probably other alliances that are helping behind the scenes as well that weren't really as powerful back then, and this giant shift in geopolitics, and I think that a lot of that plays into it as well.
Yeah.
You background alliances and stuff like that, just kind of overcoming what we're trying to do, whether that's guidance, materials, technology, whatever it might be. I think there's something bigger going on that not a lot of us can see. This line is open, but I think that they're struggling to efficiently coup governments as easily as they used to.
Yeah.
I don't know what the reason might be, but it's obvious that they're not as good at it anymore.
I would say personally, a little bit of it has to do with the rise of China itself, because
I think so too.
because China sort of created like a counter hegemon, and the Soviet Union was of course also a counter hegemon, but trade with the Soviet Union usually meant that you also had to have like a leftist government, like some sort of socialistic government. China's a lot more willing to work with just national bourgeois governments compared to like a comprador bourgeois government. So I think China has really allowed the development of a more nationalistic bourgeois within LATAM overall.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I agree too. I think it was a lot easier to demonize and attack and convince other countries that we have to attack countries just because of the Soviet Union's approach
Yeah.
to, it was very warlike and violent. And I agreed with it for the most part.
Yeah.
But it was easier as well to demonize a country and attack them and go all out. Whereas now they're still balancing markets. They're not so much taking everything involved. It's a little more of a slower transition, and China's helping with loans. They're not restructuring their systems. They're just offering different alternatives. And so I think it's a little bit harder to say, we have to attack them. We have to sanction them. It's like, for what reason?
Right.
They talk, it's like, it's
Yeah.
a lot harder to convince the world that we have to take action against countries who are just trying to do the best that they possibly can for their societies.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, there's less of a clear direct enemy this time. Like even within your country, like you could so easily say like Castro's guerrillas are just like Soviet agents or something like that. But when it's China just having good relations with your country, it's like it's your own leader, right? So even internally, it's harder to attack them, I feel like.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree for sure.
Is there anything else you want to add on to that, or?
It's actually very exciting what China's doing, and I'm very curious about how the future is going to play out with the whole BRICS alliance, the Belt and Road Initiative, all the things that they're doing. It's very fascinating the way they kind of duped the West into moving all the production into China.
Yeah.
Now they're nationalizing it, and they're kind of extending arms out to the rest of the world outside the West to kind of try to pick everyone up. But I think it's pretty amazing what they're doing. And I think it's going to be very hard for the U.S. moving forward to attack that, other than exploiting their own domestic issues with Taiwan and whatnot.
Yeah.
Kind of just playing their cards right, and I think it could possibly lead the world into a new type of socialist movement that might resemble a little bit of what they have going on, where it might be a little bit market socialism. They're just going to allow capitalism in to develop a little bit, then start capturing it. I think that's going to inspire a
Mhm.
lot of leaders around the world, and I think that's going to be the new type of movement towards communism. I think it's going to be more of a, Chinese style
Right.
communism. That's my, opinion on that matter.
Yeah, yeah. BRICS doesn't really seem that ideologically unified, though. I would say, like, it's a variety of ideologies. Like India, which like you could sort of argue is like almost fascistic right now. South Africa, which is like
Mhm.
capitalist, but they've the ANC always had good relations with the communists before, especially the
Right.
Soviet Union. Brazil, which is sort of going through like a leftward shift right now under Lula, but it's like sort of a social democratic
Mhm.
shift. And then of course like the Marxist Leninists, democratic centralists, China. It's a very odd alliance. It's a little bit loose, I would say, but it does offer a very interesting alternative to the way that the world has been set up. I will say, like the NATO block that has been set up and how the world has operated since the 90s. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. It's very interesting to see what's going to happen with that too. Can be, there's that fear mongering of de-dollarization and all those things, and that would be very interesting if that starts to play out into that direction.
yeah, yeah,
And they
absolutely.
start using their own currency, because the U.S. dollar is backed by all these nations buying our dollars to trade internationally, and when that stops happening, you can only imagine inflation's going to rise here. It's going to lead to more class struggle. And, once those things start rolling, it's hard to predict the outcome because it could go either far right or far left. But
Absolutely.
it's all I can say is I'm pretty optimistic about the future, even though things look pretty gloom and all that right now. But I'm thinking some good stuff is going to come out of what China and what the BRICS nations are trying to do, trying to get away from that one world order dollar hegemony. I think that multi-currency type of world will allow for nations to hold each other accountable collectively, even though they could disagree ideology like ideological wise. But yeah, it's very fascinating for sure, just watching how the whole thing's progressing.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah. I've always said personally, like even if China is a petite, even if it has like abandoned the revolution and things like that, like it has become imperialist. The countries with the highest developed monopoly finance capital are the Western countries. Like that, our biggest enemy is the West. Like the way that China interacts with the third world, even if it has like a monopoly finance capital and is imperialist as defined by Lenin, is a lot more favorable to global southern countries in terms of development, in terms of equal trade, in terms of just equal development. It's a very different way of interacting with them than has been done before. And I think overall, if we're gonna analyze this fairly, our biggest enemy should always be taking down the West and its monopoly finance capital. Like China is a very small player on the stage. Russia barely has anything. Things just like that. Like no country can match the level and also the exploitative practices. Like the West has insane exploitative practices that China does not seem to follow. Of course, we can
Yeah.
criticize China for its roles within like the DRC. The investments within
Mhm.
mines that use slavery, things like
Right.
that. But overall, it seems to be a much better alternative. And any good analysis should show that our biggest goal should be taking down the West first and its highly developed finance monopoly capital. Um, but
Yeah.
anyways, moving on. Recently we've sort of seen a little bit of a leftward shift within Latin America, Bolivia, Venezuela, Brazil, even under Lula, Almo in Mexico. Of course, these are not all socialists. A lot of these are social democrats, and they're not
Right.
that left. Scheinberg is currently in Mexico. I'm sorry. What do you think has been behind this leftward shift within Latin America?
It honestly could just be the conditions that the people are living under. Those all those countries that had right wing governments for a long time,
Yeah.
and just large portions of the population living in poverty just so happen to be a great force to propping these people up.
Absolutely.
And I think it's awesome the way that they've all kind of popped in around a similar time, kind of made a little pink tide going on.
Right.
But I'm pretty surprised, honestly, that these people have actually managed to get up that high without something happening to some of them, which is
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean,
and there
America's
has been
tried.
a few,
Yeah.
yeah, there has been a few. I believe it was Peru, who's running it now, Diane Bulate, I think.
I believe so. Yeah.
She's yeah, she's far right. She's like, propped up by the CIA and all that stuff. And so they had a Marxist Leninist president. So you've had people that were pretty far left that have already been kind of pulled down and replaced. But for the most part, a lot of these guys have been pretty resilient and they've maintained their support. And it's pretty awesome. You know what I mean? And I know China has a big influence in that part of the world now too, and it's pretty awesome seeing how all this stuff, like I said, is was transcendent and so yeah, not sure if I wish I had a better answer to why it's changing so rapidly. I don't, but I love it. you know?
It's also sort of gone hand in hand with just the decline of the American empire, just globally overall. Like, sort of a rot within America's empire has set in, especially after the 2008 crash, especially after the Iraq Afghanistan wars. And America's grip on the world has slowly but surely just gotten weaker and weaker, especially as China, Russia have created like sort of a new pole, you could say.
Right.
So I think definitely the rise of China can be factored into this, but I also think Latin America has just learned from past coups, right? Like Arbenz, Allende, the leaders in Bolivia, for example, they've learned how to utilize just the masses to stop coups. Venezuela, they've become sort of experts at how to stop coups with Juan Guaido, things like that. And it's through just using trust with the masses, things like that just haven't been able to be done before. And yeah, I just think that's pretty much it. China provides you an alternative that allows in a more nationalistic bourgeois, and that allows you to elect in more leftist-ish leaders, like in the case of Morena in Mexico, Lula in Brazil.
Right.
Yeah.
It's inspirational too to see how, the unions and a lot of these groups are playing such a big factor in protecting a lot of these movements. It is pretty cool. Like with Bolivia, how they were shutting down the coup, even in Venezuela and some of these other countries. I mean, like you said, it is a lot of rallying up the masses and
Yeah.
you know and spearheading that support and just kind of maintaining it. It's pretty inspiring to say the least.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it's basically, if you know Che Guevara, he was there for the coup in Guatemala with Arbenz. And when the Bay of Pigs happened, he learned what had gone wrong and what had gone right. And so, they were prepared in Cuba when America tried to pull an Arbenz in Cuba, basically. And I think just Latin America in general have been under the boot of America so long, American interference, Brazil, obviously, Chile, obviously, just Venezuela, Bolivia, obviously, that they've just sort of learned the lessons from the past on how to deal with it. They've sort of become experts, you could say.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's true. I mean, just they've learned a lot too at this point, and a lot of these dudes that are leftists, they have a good understanding of the conditions and what needs to be done. That's why it's kind of hard to kind of pick apart some of these people. Because, I mean, you think what other alternative did they have in some of the situations where it might have seemed a little excessive?
Absolutely.
When you pick apart those things, I mean, it's hard to, you know, come up with a different analysis of what could have been done or what should be done, or, you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Moving on, a lot of your content talks about what is democracy, Cuban democracy, alternatives to American democracy. What is democracy to you, and why do you think Cuba does it better than America?
I'd say democracy is ruled by the masses,
Hmm.
and I would say Cuba does it better because American democracy is just heavily flawed. Heavily flawed. I mean, there is a good. I would say local democracy is probably like a little bit better than what we have on the state level and the federal level and all that stuff. But yeah, I mean, the way Cuba organizes their society, the way they determine policy, all these things are pretty amazing when you sit back and look at how they do it. And there's plenty of things you could look at to get an understanding of it. I try to simplify it in my video, but you can read the Constitution. There's a line too on Google that I have to find it. Maybe I can give it to you, but you can call people in Cuba and they'll basically have conversations, explain the way they do things and whatnot. But um, but it's pretty inspiring. I mean, it's the elections are pretty transparent. They they're all paper ballots. Anybody can sit there and look at all the ballots. They tell everyone, they show everyone. It's not like they're sitting in back rooms hiding out. It's all opened up. Everyone can see it. They
Okay.
count in front of everybody. Um, the way that they have their Congress set up is pretty awesome. Half of it's set up by working class people that are voted in. There's their unions. All the workers get together. They vote on the employee they want to represent them. Half of that is Congress. The other half is just people that are just elected straight out of their community. So I think that's pretty awesome that you can sit there and you don't have to have money. You don't have to have anything. You can just, with just the support of your residents around you and your community, they could propel you to a seat to represent them. And I think that's pretty awesome. And when they go to talk about policies and whatnot, they sit there and hold referendum with their voters, which
Absolutely.
is something we don't do here. You know, we vote these people in after they get a shit ton of money and they come to power and then they just start, hey, I'm in for the term. And they do whatever they want, and then they get out. Well, that dude sucked. Let's vote this guy in. We'll wait another 4 years,
Right.
2 years, and it's like, there's not really, in my opinion, it's not too democratic. I mean, sure, you can argue there's some democratic value there to it, but and of course there is some questionable, um, you know, tactics within Cuba as well. Like I said, the Congress is voted on by the people.
Mhm.
The state budget is basically all the profits from all the production, because it's most of it's nationalized. I think it's like 90% of Cubans work for the state. All that all that profit basically just gets accumulated into a state budget, subsidizes things, and they can use the rest of it to basically build something that the community might want, a playground or something, or maybe they're stressing more medical needs or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
I think that's beautiful stuff. Sure, the Communist Party can kick people out at the highest level, but on the People's Congress, the lower level, they can't. And so um, there's just a lot of beautiful things for sure that they're able to do. I just wish that they had more access to international markets and international banks to gather loans, because I think it's almost the material condition of the buildings and things like that that kind of leave a negative stigma in people's mind.
Absolutely.
I think the system is beautiful set up, but without that restriction, it would only flourish, and so I think they have a very vested interest in making sure it doesn't flourish and making it look ugly and scary and whatever. Because I believe that it would inspire people to question the way that their government's set up.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely. America can't allow any alternatives. And
Yeah.
also you could very easily say that, like, at least on paper, America is a democracy that's ruled by masses. Like, people elect a representative, that representative goes, but like in practice, what is it? It's lobbying, it's multimillionaires, it's and then every single study shows that like the 1% get represented and not the 99%. And I think what Cuba does beautifully is that it also incorporates in horizontal democracy to a lot of its structures, right? So like this business, this institution, you have people constantly being able to elect into it or voice their concerns into it. And I think within a lot of structures of America, it is, as funny as it is, Cuba's often represented as top down and, you know, authoritarian, but America's more top down and authoritarian in that, like, how much say do we have in our representatives or a Senate, really? Like, we only get to elect them once every 2-4 years. We don't get to, like, recall them like they do in Cuba. We don't get to bring our representatives in and call them in for questioning like they do in Cuba. Representatives get questioned every couple election cycles by their constituents about why they are meeting their needs, why they aren't meeting their community's needs. And so
Yeah.
I think, yeah, it's exactly that. Like, on paper, America is a democracy, but in practice, it's really just rule of a tiny minority.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it always has been for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I kind of funny too, because a lot of libertarians and stuff will say like it's always been we the people, this and that. But, you know, just from the get go, it was only, you know, white Christian men that owned land, and it just took forever for that ball to open up and just roll and let everybody else own. You know, this whole idea that we've been fighting, you know, the word is democracy and this and that, whatever. I think we've been struggling to create a better democracy, and it kind of went south
Mm-hmm.
around Bush's administration when they decided corporations are voters and people, and they could donate as much as possible into political campaigns. Um, so that it kind of went south around that time period. But yeah, for the most part, I mean, I think there's a lot we could learn from Cuba. Definitely a lot that we could learn
Absolutely.
from them. A lot of strategies that we could try to adopt that other countries in Latin America have taken to try to push that ball forward here and open up, if it's possible, just make more progressive steps to giving people more power, you know, and I don't know how realistic that would be now. It's so late in the game, but I mean, anything's possible, honestly, if it's organized. You know, I
Absolutely.
mean, I think Cuba's been very strong in proving that, being that they've gone through so much hardship, you know, through special periods, through periods where there was just devastating shortages of things that were super important. And because they stayed organized, they were able to defend that revolution that they fought for and not let it crumble.
Yeah,
You
yeah, and
know?
and they also kept people's involvement within these institutions in every step of the way. Even when they were like
Mhm.
implementing in like free market reforms after the a special period, they still kept like when they would allow something go into the free market, they would still allow people to elect things in, have say within them. So I think Cuba's sort of unlike China, which has been more like which has allowed the free market in more with like a little bit less participation bottom up. Cuba has allowed in a horizontal
Yeah,
democracy into like every single free market reform that they've done out of necessity, you know, especially after the Soviet Union's collapse. Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, they allow people to participate in multiple different levels through their workplaces. They have community watches where they could sit there and report potholes or whatever might be in the road and try to
Yeah.
get the attention of higher ups to bring materials in so they could patch what they can, what they can't. There's all types of things that allow people to integrate into how the society progresses that I don't think really exists here for the most part. It's very much more individualistic here, where it's, you know, of course we have, you know, people that come fix potholes and stuff like that. But for the most part, it almost feels like Americans are kind of separate from their government,
Yeah.
whereas it's almost rogue a little bit to a certain extent. I mean, it just works for a small minority of people. And whereas Cubans, for the most part, stays pretty genuine and stays in line with the interests of their people, you know, and you know, it's pretty awesome. You know what I mean? To
Yeah.
say the least.
Yeah, and oftentimes it's in America it's almost scary, right? To like be collectivist, to take care of other people. It's almost marketed as like being a mindless drone. But this hyper individualistic culture that America has led to so many mental health issues, so much depression, so much loneliness. It really is sort of the ultimate example of capitalist alienation, where people are sort of subsumed into the hegemon of capitalism, right? The cultural hegemony of capitalism, where they're even afraid to break their own alienation in a way. Uh, Cuba like has like these amazing things where like for every housing community, sort of, I don't know what you could call them, like apartment blocks, things like that, they'll have like a doctor there. So like you'll have a community
Yeah.
doctor. So like if you're sick
Yeah.
or something, you have preventative medicine immediately available to you, to your doctor. You just walk up to your doctor's door, you knock on it, your community doctor, he lives with you in the apartment. Even if he's not on duty, you're just like, hey, I'm a little bit sick, things like that. I think in America that's scary, right? That feels like the government's trying to impose something on me. You know, it's a distrust to other human beings to a self-destructive manner.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up too, because it is actually really cool the way they do that. I know exactly what you're talking about. They'll have every neighborhood has a doctor that goes through once a month. They'll go around, just do a little bit of blood work, check on people's vitals and whatnot. Because the idea is they want to catch something before it turns into a triple bypass, open
Absolutely.
heart surgery, whatever it is. So they're trying to catch an issue before it turns into a problem. Whereas in the US, because it's so profit driven, it's like that old saying, a patient cured is a client lost. You know what I mean? A doctor would rather just give you a medicine that will temporarily put a bandage over the issue, but not ultimately solve it. And they'll just allow you to get just maintained or progressively decline until you got to go into the hospital and you pay, out the ass in medical bills. And so I think there's an incentive to not go over and above to really keep your citizens healthy. There's an incentive to, to keep them buying medicine, keep them coming back every single month so they have to take this pill for the rest of their life. Like there's an incentive to just not keep people that healthy. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
That's one thing I think is really cool about Cuba's system is they're trying to do the opposite. They're trying to keep people as healthy as possible because it's more affordable for the community and society as a whole. Because they're trying to use capital to basically serve the needs of the people, whereas we're just trying to extract capital.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, every single worker produces surplus value, right? And that surplus value gets skimmed off the top, basically for a purpose, right? So you produce more value than you get paid, basically, and so that surplus value that you produced, somebody gets it. And under socialism like Cuba, that goes back to you. So if you buy an item or you work, that surplus value goes back to you or your community. And in America, under capitalism, it just goes to some rich asshole, right? Like in a mansion, and he just sits on top of it, and then he reinvests it to get more surplus value from other people, and he just keeps that cycle going. And it's just a cycle of misery where the only person who wins is that one rich asshole, and then maybe like a couple of people who get into like what we would call like the upper middle class, like things like that. So I don't know. It seems like a lose-lose situation, whereas I want my surplus value to be used for something useful, like not.
I mean, capitalism is good at just maintaining an endless loop of capital accumulation and extraction of natural resources and things like that, but it's super unsustainable when you think about it. And so something's going to have to give eventually.
Absolutely.
And a lot of these things are just going to have to be phased out because you can't do it forever,
Absolutely. So do you think that most people in America are socialist without realizing it? And why do you think that it might be, if you do?
That's a good question. Honestly, I think for the most part, yes, I would say so. If they have a clear understanding of what it is, I do believe most people would be socialists. And you could easily prove that by just talking ideas to people without mentioning the word socialism. And 9 times out of 10, they'll be like, wow, dude, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
You should office, and so I think a lot of the ideas very much resonate with all the people, most people. And then for the people who have that position where it's kind of a contradiction to them,
Yeah.
they're certainly got to figure it out. Be like, no, that's a horrible idea. You know, so,
Yeah.
so it is. Yeah, I would say so. I'd say most people, because it's what is it like 70 or 60% of people are somewhere around there are just working class people that just work their whole lives and they just maintain an endless loop of just working and working just to keep buying access to the things they need. And whether it's through rent or temporary ownership or whatever it may be, they're constantly just working. So I think that idea of, man, what if we just used what we're doing now to produce things like we needed and that be the end of it? You know what I mean? And we just maintain it and just follow up with the upkeep. You know what I mean? I think that'd make a lot more sense to people than people owning everything and extracting your value for trying to access it. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. I think one thing that a lot of Marxists have struggled with is like, by all logical conclusions, the majority of human beings should be socialist, right? Like the majority of human beings, capitalism does not work for us. This system has created so much excess, and yet there's artificial scarcity, right? Like we have enough food to feed everybody, and yet people still go hungry. We have enough houses to house everybody, and yet there's still homeless people, and it's because capitalism always trends towards exchange value of commodities rather than use value, right? So capitalists are more concerned with how much money can I make off of the house rather than what the house is used for, which is to live in, or how much money can I make off of this piece of bread rather than what it's used for, which is to be eaten. And so by all logical conclusions, most people should be socialist, and yet they're not. And it's a very odd conundrum for us, which I think brings me to the other question, like, why do you think so many people think they are capitalist, even if when you talk to them and you talk about socialism, they agree with it? Like, why do you think so many people consider themselves pro-capitalist, even though effectively they're not?
Honestly, I think that I think the U.S. is honestly the master of propaganda,
Absolutely.
and I think nobody does it better than the U.S.
Absolutely.
But I think that a lot of these people just believe that a lot of people that I talk to don't have a correct idea of what capitalism is. They're like, I bought a car, I'm a capitalist, you know? And so those people, I feel like, don't know what it is to be a capitalist. They
Right.
think buying makes them a capitalist or selling something makes them a capitalist, And so um, I think it's a little bit of that. Also, maybe it's that thought that, I could be that person eventually, that pursuit of profit. Maybe
Absolutely.
some people believe that they could be in that position, and man, that would be good if I could just live off of, these guys' labor, then I could just buy a yacht and just have them work all day and I just collect all the surplus. You know what I mean? So I think that's appealing to some people because we're kind of taught at a young age to chase the bag, the fame, the lights, the fancy cars, the house.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think that's kind of like branded into people's brains, and
I mean, even
so
if
plays a fact.
I'm sorry for cutting you off, but
But you're good.
even if you are not like economically a capitalist, like you're a worker, I think America is so good at turning you mentally into one. Where like even a dude from like a trailer park who lives off of welfare, maybe he's convinced that his interests are the same as Donald Trump's, right? Like this multimillionaire. It's I think America is so good at that, and I think what's really funny is like in China, if there's state media or something like that, like if there's some kind of narrative being drawn on, so many people within China are like, yeah, this is obviously like a very heavily controlled, propagandized version of this narrative, and I should take this with a grain of salt, right? But within America, our propaganda is so good that whenever this propaganda is given within the media, within our State Department, people take that as a whole truth, and they're not even able to recognize that it's a narrative, right? Like under communist countries, it's so much easier to just say, oh, it's a state news agency, so obviously, you know, it's going to be true, it's going to be false, it's a heavily filtered idea. But under America, because we have this sort of illusion of a free press, illusion of free thought, people are unable to just say, I should take this with a grain of salt, and they just take it as an objective truth. If you want to pick up on any of the threads I laid down.
No, no, I completely agree. I mean, I think it's that idea of the word free in it, like free enterprise, free market. People think it's like, wow, this is a free system, you know, but it's like, it's not really like, I think those words are misleading, you know, because it's not really free. Like people control it. They control the prices. They
Absolutely.
control production. They control the direction of society. And it's a minority of people,
Very
you know,
large
so it's not,
monopolies.
yeah, you know, it's not like we're all free and we're all in this together. It's like you got this small group of people that are heavily invested into politics. They're heavily controlling most of the important stuff throughout our society, whether that be the media and all these other things as well. That kind of act as an arm for them. Um, and I think that kind of creates this illusion that, you know, because we call them these things, we're better off with a freer, or we're less susceptible to, you know, some type of lie or something
Yeah.
like that. And then, um, yeah, I mean, I think that's, you know, honestly that. And another thing I wanted to say too is a lot of people have a concept of socialist and communist too, that they want the government to take over things and stuff like that, which for the most part, like, yeah, sounds like a great idea, but there's also the other aspect of it. Like, I wouldn't be in favor, for example, of the government nationalizing a few things right now at this current state that it's in right now, because if
Mhm.
they national these big industries, then it's basically the capitalists that are controlling the government, and they have the nationalized production in their hands. You know what I
Absolutely.
mean? That to their advantage. So I think there's that, maybe that's something I gotta talk about more, but um the idea of seizing the state for the public and the public integrating in and kind of flipping that position on its back, where it's these larger monopolies and stuff out of being suppressed by us when we have to say over production. Achieving that, I feel like, is one of the most important things. And then kind of nationalizing things as well in the process. I mean, I think that would just come natural,
Yeah, yeah.
you know?
I think when a lot of people envision socialism, they envision like a capitalist government nationalizing things, and it's like, well, it's still a dictatorship of the bourgeois. Like there's still class
Yeah.
interests in there, and so like whenever people are saying like, oh my God, socialism is so terrible, like the DMV is awful, like yeah, of course it's nationalism under it's nationalized under a capitalist government. Of course, it's going to be terrible because the incentives are to defund it as much as possible, like give it barely any funding,
Yeah.
move all the assets towards the private sector, like things like that. And then also, I think American propaganda is so effective because America is like one of the few populations on Earth that believe that they're free thinkers, right? Like we're the only people that genuinely believe we're not propagandized. Like people in Russia, people in China, they know that there's a narrative that they are fed, and that you know it's a catered narrative. I think that's just impossible for Americans to do because it's so much harder to just point at one person, right? Like under a free market system, which is really just like a couple of monopolies, there are these shadowy monopolies like G&E and like these Turner Broadcasting, these large news monopolies, these large things like that, and it's just so hard to point at like Putin or like President Xi, like
Right.
things like that, as being the narrative creator.
That's one thing too. I feel like as the conditions of a society like ours start to decline, I think that's gonna raise the question of truthfulness and things like that. It's gonna cause more of a separation of political parties. I think it was easier to think that everything's just great. It doesn't matter, like, if we vote this way or that way, it's still everything's going good because we were riding it up, you know.
Yeah.
And now coming down, I think groups are going to get more polarized. You're going to see more separation um, between communities, people, whatever. Now you see like, people saying they hate California, they hate Texas, or whatever it may be. You're getting all this little back and forth and whatnot. I think that's going to increase, and that's going to follow with the media and stuff like that too. Funny that Trump kind of coined that whole fake news thing, but I think that's only going to amplify as times get worse. I think people are going to start to have kind of that idea that other countries have, that maybe we're being force fed some bullshit. I think that's going to be more mainstream.
Yeah, and I think like people who are pro Trump, like they get very close to the truth. Like the system obviously is broken. The media obviously does feed you a certain narrative, but their solutions are always wrong. Like it's a very disgusting nativism, deep like Mexican people, like it's woke culture, it's LGBTQ people, and so they're on the money. Like a lot of the times Trump is on the money. I'm not gonna lie. Like when he says like the media is broken, our government is broken, like yeah, it is. And I think Democrats don't want to admit that. Like Democrats very often just say everything's dandy, everything's fine, like don't question what's going on. Don't you even like questioning the way that things are right now makes you like a crazy QAnon conspiracy theorist, right? And obviously I'm not like a fan of like QAnon or anything like that, but these people get so close to it, but their solutions are always just off a cliff. Like, I'm going to get into a utopia by deporting all Mexicans. Like, it's just ridiculous things like that.
That's too, because I'm a very open person. I love talking with people who don't have the same viewpoint as me to see how far I can pull it my way.
Yeah.
And, I've done a lot of construction in the past and stuff, and you'll see that oftentimes on construction sites where a lot of people in that type of field, for the most part, drift into that MAGA mindset. It's funny because I've sat there and had these conversations with people, and they're like, "Oh yeah, Elon Musk," and they'll bring up Soros and all these things and stuff like that, and they'll get there, and the government, we got to drain it, we got to this and that. I'm like, yes, and then they're like, and then we got to deport all the illegals, and and we got to like. And they just go on this big, Christians got to take over, and then it just turns into this big, like, no.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that Parenti quote, anything but the C word, anything but the class word, right? Like distracting people from the class struggle as much as possible. We've talked about China a little throughout this podcast. Obviously, China is a very controversial topic, but they did open up their markets in the 70s, 80s under a democratic centralism. How successful do you think China's experiment has been, its free market Dengist experiment?
Honestly, I think it's been pretty successful. I think they could have maintained the same type of Maoist movement. I don't think it would have advanced as quickly. It would have had a lot of struggles, and it probably would have been acceptable to, just an imperialist war. I could imagine eventually they try to break it up or something. Who knows what could have happened? But I think that the decision to do that was kind of scary, but it's very interesting too. For the most part, they just kind of let the bottom half of the economy do what it's going to do. They opened it up, and they kind of maintained control over all the economic heights of the economy. So all the important sectors, the state basically plays a giant role in controlling them. And they kind of just let the bottom half do its thing. So I think that was a giant incentive, because we had giant union movements and all those things over here. How just the process of capitalism, if left to itself, incentivizes them to move production away from just the class struggle it creates. And I think it was great at capturing a lot of very important production, from Europe and from the United States. And I thought that was pretty brilliant of them, honestly. I don't know if anyone put two and two together back then and thought that would happen. They probably thought that capitalism would just prevail and they would overthrow it. But I think it was pretty risky, but I think what ended up Transcendent was pretty beautiful. I mean, for the most part, they're able to capture a lot of production in the process. They kind of let these things run their course. When they go bankrupt or whatever, they just let them collapse. They don't bail them out. They let them collapse and then they just nationalize them. You know what I mean? So I think it was pretty genius. They now they're basically the manufacturer of the world because they basically tricked all these capitalists that's moving all their production there to exploit people, and then they went ahead and started nationalizing all the failed experiments as they progressively failed. And so there's still a lot of it that's capitalist. You can't deny it, but um, for the most part, I think what they're doing is they're just going to allow these things to progressively build socialism. You know, they're just going to keep nationalizing production. And from what I've read, they're hoping to reach, you know, a developed social society by 2020 or 2050.
2050,
You know?
yeah.
So, I'm not sure if I lost you there.
Uh-huh. Oh, do you still have me? Hold on. Let me.
Yeah, interesting stuff though, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. I think China has been a very interesting dialectical experiment in terms of, first of all, it was a very progressive ideology, communism, in one of the most backwards places on earth, like a semi-feudalist economy. And they obviously didn't have their a capitalist base to hop off of that, which is like what traditional Marxists thought was needed. And they built a socialism from that, and that was amazing. And now they've done another dialectical experiment where it's almost the exact opposite. It's a communist-controlled government overheading a capitalist sort of market. You know, it's under democratic centralism. So I think it's an interesting dialectical experiment. Obviously, it has come with contradictions of its own. You know, like special economic zones within China have like very few workers' rights. There has been a little bit of an uptick in labor agitation within China because obviously introducing in Dengism led to like a big drawback in workers' rights. But I think everybody in the world is just sort of keeping their eye on China just to see where it goes. Does China and the CPC get corrupted by the free market forces that's introduced and give up on building socialism, or does it beautifully and dialectically build a base for a future socialist experiment, you know, slowly but surely, you know, it has like a block of marble and it's like shaping out like a beautiful communism out of it, you know, or a socialism out of it, you know.
And that's what I'm thinking might be the that might be the future direction for Marxism. As scary as it sounds, it seems like creating a communist state government and allow for the economy to kind of do its thing, but allowing the public to kind of have a hand in the direction of things might be the future strategy. You know what I mean? Because I know the Soviets were hoping they could just, you know, win over Germany and, you know, kind of forward capture production and kind of release it that way. Now it seems like it's going to be coming out of the developing world. And it might fall along those lines of, you know, creating a government of the people and trying to protect that from market forces and from those with money and fighting against corruption, keeping it organized. That might be, you know, it might be a valuable lesson. So I guess history will tell.
Right. I would have to disagree a little bit. I will say that, you know, violent class struggle is still needed for a type of socialism. But I definitely will say that the world right now is just more so trending towards a nationalist bourgeois from the global south. Whereas before, the global south has been under a comprador bourgeois. So a bourgeois state that it basically sells off its assets. The world right now, because of the restructuring of China and this multipolarity, is headed more towards like a nationalistic bourgeois movement where the governments protect their own assets, similar to, you know, Mossadegh in Iran, Arbenz in Guatemala, things like that, where it's still capitalism. The class struggle is still there. And ultimately for socialism, you still do need like a violent bottom-up revolution. but they're protecting their assets better and better. I would say it's not the Chinese model that's specifically winning. I'd say it's more like the Iranian model, right? With Khomeini, things like that, where it's not Islamist, but it's these native elements that protect their own assets, such as oil,
Right.
minerals, but they still keep in capitalism, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's pretty scary too, because that's almost a recipe for war.
Yeah,
So yeah, no, that's definitely true as well. To think about, I mean, there is a lot of nationalistic type of tendencies that are, especially, I've seen a lot of them coming out of Europe too.
right, right. But
So
I would say the nationalism within the global South, its main contradiction is Western imperialism. So nationalist governments within the global South are a lot more willing to work with each other than fight each other. Then say within the West, we're more prone towards a nasty kind of nationalism.
yeah, yeah, that's the thing. I mean, yeah, like I stated earlier, that's that class struggle. Just you don't know what direction it can go and go far right, far left. So we're hoping for the far left, the challenged. But you know, I think that's where a lot of like the practices and the things that are going on in Latin America become inspiring.
Absolutely.
I hate to say that I feel like I don't see as much of that happening in the Eastern world, throughout like Asia and Africa for the
Right,
most part.
right.
Um, but it's yeah,
There are points of hope though, like Latin America, Africa very recently. Yeah,
yeah. I try to stay optimistic because it seems like for the most part too, and the Palestine movement is a great example of that. It seems like a
absolutely.
lot of are on board with this internationalism of you know human rights and dignity and not really. I feel like the governments in a lot of these countries are the ones that are kind of portraying this nationalistic type of outpour. I mean, of course, there's people that are involved as well on the grassroots level, but I feel like they're more or less minority groups. Like they're not really like the public at large. You know what I'm trying to say? Like
Absolutely.
that that gives me hope. That gives me hope that um hopefully it would create the conditions to kind of just crush that force, and push the you know, push it the opposite way,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, and
Oh, that's one thing that I do not like about China. There's I feel like they could, although it could be dangerous for them, but I would love to see more of a just kind of like an outreach of guidance to kind of try to drive Marxist principles into other countries that are trying to
absolutely.
develop. Like the Soviet Union was, I mean, they were badass about that. I love the fact that they would go in there and just train people and said, listen, this is what we got to do, or, you're going to have an open hole in your boat. You know what I mean? Like,
Absolutely, absolutely. The Soviet Union would try to overthrow your government, basically, sometimes.
if they would help, they would arm them and they would arm the peasants and the workers
Yeah,
and they would organize with them and you know what I mean? That internationalism was beautiful, and I feel like China doesn't have that to a
no,
great extent.
no.
You know what I
China
mean?
more so just works with the existing structures currently. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and that point, sure, but it could be part of the strategy. Who knows? They might pull a rabbit out of the hat.
Maybe, maybe. I think that's more of a long term thing. For now, they're more so pursuing a peace, détente, you could say, with the West. Um, you talked about Venezuela. How much of Venezuela's issues would you say are self inflicted? Like self error, and how much of them are outside factors?
If I had to say, I would think a good like 40% is probably self-inflicted.
Right.
Maybe a little bit higher than that, honestly, because I mean, it wasn't their fault. They got handed. I mean, with Chavez not came to power, Venezuela already established to be a petro state. It was already going to be extracting that for the most part. And so, they kind of just took that and just tried to use it to develop the material needs of the Venezuelan people.
Yeah.
And I think they were inspired by places like North World, stuff like that. They quickly found out that they're not allowed to do these types of, you know, reforms and whatnot, kind of like Europeans have been able to. And I think that kind of pushed them, into a tough position. But, like I said, I mean, they had the perfect setup going on. I mean, of just subsidizing everything, building things up, houses, hospitals. And
Right.
they were on their way to kind of mimicking what the Cubans did with the sugar production. And, you know, that put them in a risky situation, just being dependent on the oil market. You know what I mean?
Right.
Having their to be based on that. I mean, of course, they didn't think Saudi Arabia would just start flooding the market with oil, but I think that left them extremely vulnerable. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Right. Oh, what year did Saudi Arabia start flooding the market with oil? That was like 2004?
Um, no, well, I think there was a little bit of that around that time, but then it happened again around, I believe it was 2014.
2014. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, they were having issues with Russia, and they were all fighting over the oil and whatnot. They just started flooding the market with the oil to kind of just secure market shares and try to drive down the prices to kind of sabotage some of their competitors.
Right.
And Venezuela just being out there is just like fuck,
Right. Right.
They're on the other side and they
We're
know
dependent on this oil.
that. Yeah, on the how like can't finance anything, and it kind of sucks, you know what I mean? And they caught out for it, and it opened up a whole. This is the perfect opportunity to do them. You know what I mean? And
Absolutely. Yeah.
it just, them trying to gather control over the situation as things were just collapsing into chaos. I mean, prices were just skyrocketing overnight, and people just start freaking the fuck out. They don't know what's going on. They just see everything's going crazy, and one thing leads to the other, and they're trying to gain control of that. Oh, look at they're authoritarian, and so it left them in a vulnerable position that allowed us to just pick them apart a little bit and try to overthrow them. And I think we've been just trying to maintain that same poke. You know what I mean? Just trying to get it to collapse.
Right. Right. They've obviously
I
been
think,
pushed to an edge, and then America's been trying to apply pressure to them consistently ever since, with sanctions, with announcing that Juan Guaido is the official president of Venezuela, which was insane. Even though he wasn't running for the presidency, even I don't. Yeah, no, Venezuela. Oh no, go ahead.
oh no, I was just thinking, he's like, I'm here to run the government, or will they would all this dude? You know what I mean? It's just kind of silly how he just came out of nowhere and yeah, they just try to point him. You know what I mean? But yeah, I mean it was a tough situation for sure. I'm valid for sure about what happened, and I mean it's horrible that all these people had to endure all that. But yeah, I mean that's the thing. They're starting to diversify now. If you look at their market, and so I'm hoping for the best. I'm hoping they maintain that and they prevent themselves from being toppled.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. The Venezuelan, the Bolivarian Revolution absolutely gave the people of Venezuela like so many democratic gains, right? Like, whereas before they were like very poor. It was a comprador country essentially. Chevron, Shell, basically owned all their oil assets. All the wealth went towards America and American companies. The Bolivarian Revolution nationalized that oil. It said, you know what, the surplus value from this oil is going to go back to the people in housing, as you said, in healthcare. But then, like you said, 2014, because their economy was just heavily focused on oil, and that was something that they inherited, it just turned the situation into the shitter, right? Like when Saudi Arabia starts flooding the market with oil and you're relying on oil, that's not a good time. It's almost like they had their own special period. But I also think that Venezuela has made mistakes. Like Maduro, very recently, he's isolated himself from the left. He's led to a split with the Venezuelan Communist Party, the PCV, I believe, is they're called.
Yeah.
Um, they've also overprinted money, leading to inflation, and of course, we can understand why they did that. But that was obviously a mistake on their end, and so it's twofold. It's twofold. You know, it's both an outside factor and an insular factor, and unfortunately, I mean, if you want to do socialism, you're relying on the world market. Like that's permanent revolution. That just does not work. We cannot go to war with everybody and turn everybody socialist around us, and so you are dependent on just so many outside factors, especially when you're a nation like Venezuela that did not have that much independence before.
Yeah. And when you have to depend on the other nations to keep your society afloat, it's definitely difficult for sure to maintain that balance. And that's just why it's one thing that it drives me nuts when people just will sit there and say, they'll just make a quick like, oh, well, socialism failed because of Venezuela. You know what I mean? It's
Right.
look at the concept. I mean, that would have happened anyways if it was owned by if that was owned by Shell and all these other groups, I mean, or if it was owned by just some capitalist in Venezuela, I mean, maybe not, but they would have definitely taken a big blow for the
Still,
most part.
yeah.
They could have failed. They could have failed for sure. They would have probably been bailed out by the World Bank or somebody. But when you have all these powers against you, it's hard to recover.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry for cutting you off, but if you want an example of like the free market and oil and things like that, like the city I live in is like a very heavy oil economy, and every couple of years there's just mass layoffs. Like every couple of years the oil market goes to shit, and so suddenly you see like a bunch of like oil engineers, rig workers on welfare, homeless. Things like that. And so I really highly doubt that a privatized market in Venezuela could have saved it from that 2014 crash. I really doubt that. In fact, I think socialism helped so many people avoid the brunt of just the free market, pretty much. Like the situation could have been 100 times worse.
If anything, it would have probably failed and some other bigger group would have came in and bought it up.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Just ate it up. And capitalism fails all the time. I mean, there's all types of businesses that are constantly falling, collapsing, and going under and stuff like that. And so this idea that it doesn't happen under capitalism it just goes back to that, people don't understand all these different factors, things like that.
Yeah.
Well, it's complex for sure.
Absolutely.
Simple as it should be our job as Marxists and things like that to sit there and analyze it and try to simplify it as much as possible so people that aren't really thinking about it. So,
yeah. And then also at least like when shit hits the fan, somebody's like attempting to help you through it. Like when shit hits the fan in my hometown and the oil economy crashes, you're out on your ass pretty much. Like you don't have a job anymore and you're just stressing to pay bills and your mortgage and nobody's coming to help you or save you. In Venezuela, when the economy crashes, there's people's communes and government structures that are still trying to do their best to give you health care and things like that. Like there's still an attempt to help you.
Yeah, absolutely. Those things, and those are very inspirational too. I love the people's communes ideas, and you even see that in places like Cuba too.
Yeah,
talk to people from Cuba and stuff like that. They'll tell you like when they go through hardships and things like that, and they have some American family members who are sending them stuff, they'll start handing it out to people in their communities and stuff like that, and sharing things and just trying to. There's just a sense of community that doesn't, for the most part, doesn't exist in most of America. You know what I mean? It's like most people don't really know their neighbors. And when shit goes down, it's just they're looking at you through blinds, It's like, wow, sucks for him. You know what I mean? That sense of bringing each other up and stuff like that is kind of absent here a little bit. That's one thing I remember my wife telling me about when she first came here is that cultural shock,
Where is your wife from?
She's from Colombia.
Colombia. Oh, okay. Yeah. I think no, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just gonna say she lived on the border of Venezuela, and so she would constantly, growing up, go over the border, and basically enjoy the benefits that the Venezuelans were enjoying. You know, she would go in there, and made a comment about that video of Venezuela. She went over there and got braces for like $5. You know, she went over there and got clothes for practically free. You know, medicine was practically free. Checkups, you know, these things were all free, or if not free, almost free. You know
Oh
what I
my
mean?
God.
And so because the government was just subsidizing all these things that were coming in, and of course, some people can make, you know, the argument that shut a lot of um, the productive factors inside of Venezuela down, because it was just a lot better to go to these things, that these other stores that were basically free, than to go to someone who was trying to, you know, compete with that.
Yep.
And so it did shut businesses down, but, you know, um, so I guess that could be, you know, a fault factor or whatever. Um, but still, though, a lot of people were inspired by that stuff. You know what I mean? Until it came crashing down, then it was like, whoa, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine getting braces for like $5. Like it's 1,000 something in America, which is insane.
yeah,
Clothes, everything is expensive in America, and might not be the best like Gucci bag or something, but at least you have something to clothe yourself with. At least you have something to feed yourself with.
absolutely, yeah, sure, something
Mm.
better than that.
Absolutely, absolutely. In a lot of your videos, you just talk about basically how we should just imagine a better world beyond capitalism. This is sort of the final question. Why do you think it's so much? Why do you think it's so important to just dream of something better than what we have now? Like why can't we just do reformism, or like think within the capitalist system?
Um, because the system doesn't work for us. So I think
Mm,
the principal idea is to get people to understand different concepts, and get them to imagine what their community would look like
absolutely.
if they were working and using that money that they make to bring everybody up. What it would look like to not drive down the street and see some dude on the corner like begging for food and stuff, and um, you know, not having to sit there and watch one of your employees get like walked out or something like that. And there's nothing you could do about it. Just like random stuff that happens that kind of alienates you and just makes you feel like, you know, you're not in control of anything. Um, just thinking of I think just having that idea that, wow, imagine if, you know, the government works for us. Imagine if, you know, we had a say in production. Imagine if we could, you know, voice our opinions on what we should do
Yeah,
with the law collectively making. I hope people have these ideas in their head. It would kind of push them to question what needs to be done, and kind of inspire people to look at what has been done and come up with their own. Just get people talking back and forth, and start those conversations. And I believe those conversations would just lead to people, you know, finding solidarity amongst each other,
absolutely.
and common interests, and and that could pave the path for organizing. Of course, like talking can only, you know, pave roads for that, and actually doing community work, like going out there and playing a role in your community and get people to look at say, you know, I think that is a huge factor as well, that could possibly be stronger than just talking about it. I think that could inspire people to join these groups and organizations and listen to what these people that are doing these things have to say. And so I think there's just having these ideas, throwing them out there, letting people digest them, think about it if their mind is open enough to do that. And I think that could just pave the path for something better. You know what I mean? I think America was starting to build that foundation to, you know, a worker's consciousness, the government, all these things, because we're declining, like I said. So as we continue to decline, I think these ideas are going to start to amplify, and they're going to get louder, and on both sides. And so it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But I'm pretty optimistic that it is ultimately people's love for one another and urge for community. I believe humans naturally or socially, we want to be connected to our neighbors. We want to talk to people. We want to feel like we're contributing to the things around us. Um, just hoping just that those feelings will and the thoughts will kind of bring people to these conclusions, that we have to do something radical.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think Americans are just so socialized to just think that any alternative is scary, right? Like even if we are on like a slow decline and everybody at this point is sort of able to recognize that this system is not working and cannot last that long to some degree. But because like socialism is so demonized, like, well, what if we get a Venezuela? What if we get like a Cuba? What if we get like a China? Like, because they're unable to learn about how these countries actually are, any alternative to this is scary. And so I think a lot of Americans right now are sort of in a mode of, I would much rather our whole world ends and I keep the system going because any alternative to me is scary. And our job as Marxists is just to show people that it's not scary. Like alternatives are not scary. In fact, they're needed.
Yeah, it could be beautiful. I mean, a lot of these revolutions, especially Cuba. I mean, Cuba is like one of those ones that you could always go to because right after the revolution, it wasn't really a bloody revolution, and right afterwards, you had groups of teachers getting together, marching out into different, campesinos and or just little villages and all these places with pencils and books and sitting down and teaching people how to read things, how to write their own name, how to understand things, and just teaching people all types of things they never had any clue about. Lots of beautiful things happened. Yes, there was a little period of like chaos, but then something beautiful came out of it for the most part for a little while.
Absolutely.
All types of things, but and every situation is gonna be different, of course. But
yeah, Russian and Chinese socialism were a little bit more chaotic.
yeah,
they were operating under like completely different conditions, and Cuba could rely on help from them. So Cuba was able to be more stable thanks to them. But
yeah,
and
all these that are making these tides for sure, I believe, are taking the breath of the force out of these transitions and making it easier to kind of push that way a little bit.
yeah.
And those first couple of steps and leaps, for sure, were violent because they were fighting against something bigger than themselves and trying to cope with that and come out of it. And I think as more countries kind of link together and make little moves, it gets easier.
Yeah, easily. Like Korea, Vietnam, Vietnam's revolution. Obviously they were bloody. There were periods of blood, but thanks to just these big brother nations like China, the Soviet Union, just sort of guiding them, helping them, giving them aid, like the transition to socialism is a lot smoother. And now we have just this beautiful host of countries that, like, if and when America is ready for socialism or of some kind, we will get a lot of help, just even in planning it, right? Like people who have made these mistakes before and can help us out. And it's just beautiful internationalism,
Yeah, that's kind of like with Richard Wolff. I remember I was watching one of his videos once, and he was talking about how capitalism took 500 years to come out of feudalism. It took a long ass time.
Yeah.
And just struggled being put down by the lords and by the nobles, and eventually it just kind of gave out like one after the other. And then eventually it was just getting overthrown everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so and who knows, socialism could be the same way. Hopefully it's not nationalism, but yeah, I mean, the future will play out the way it plays out. Hopefully it goes in our favor, but we'll see. In the meantime, we're just going to keep talking about it.
Yeah, that's all we can do. Educate, organize, help people understand, get involved in the community, and then other than that, it's up to history. But thank you so much for coming on, Marxist Miguel. Tell people where they can find you, and if you have any closing remarks, just say them.
Yeah. You can find me on TikTok at the moment at Marxist Miguel. I'm going to open up a YouTube channel and start moving some of my content out that way as well.
Same name?
Same name.
Okay.
Same name. For the time being, that's all I got. Like I said, I never was social media too much. I was kind of pushing that direction, and now I'm kind of liking it. So, who knows how I branch off into other spaces. But for now, you can find me with TikTok. Yeah, I appreciate you bringing me on here. Love your content. Thank you.
Of course. Check out Marxist Miguel, the best Florida man there is. And thank you so much for coming on.
I guess, man.
You have a good one. This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you.
What the fuck? Glory to Stalin. I barely made.
And a special shout out to our Marshal of the Soviet Union member, Matthias T. If you'd also like a shout out, please consider subscribing to our Patreon, where you can also get episodes up to a month early. Thank you.